All right, thank you, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Commissioner, I'm going to hand it to you for some opening remarks to lead us off.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. We are really fortunate in the state of New Jersey to have a really concerted partnership across all of state government on our climate policy imperatives. One of those being how we really invest from both a financial perspective, but also from a governance perspective in becoming a state of resilience. And so we're fortunate to be joined today by a number of leaders in New Jersey, not the least of which is Jane Cohen, the executive director of our governor's office of climate action and the green economy, who just yesterday released the state's green economic strategy. So just a little bragging on our climate week goodness there. But for the purpose of today's panel, or round table rather, what we wanted to focus on is the imperative to ensure that we are building resilience across all communities, right? In the state of New Jersey, we think of our climate policy really at its simplest as reducing and responding to climate change. Reducing meaning climate mitigation, taking every step that we can as fast as we can to reduce emissions of climate pollutants, and responding by building our resilience to the adverse climate effects that we are already experiencing, and that sadly will only get worse from here, regardless of our emissions reductions, right? We reduce those emissions to stave off a worsening of those effects, but they're going to get worse for a little more time to come, a function of the emissions we've already pumped into the atmosphere. So in the state of New Jersey, what does that mean? Sea level rise increases in storm surge, like we experienced during Superstorm Sandy, the 10th anniversary of which we will mark next month. Increases in extreme precipitation and rising temperatures. And these issues are expected to negatively impact our economy, right? Including in the housing market, in the mortgage and lending sectors in our regions, right? And from the science, we see that natural systems, human decisions, both contribute to an increased climate risk, as well as individuals and firms and governments are at the same time developing a better understanding of climate risks, and that we see how adaptation will become necessary to limit damage to homeowners, to communities, to the statewide economy, right? Large financial institutions, they're no longer asking if climate change is real. We're lucky to be joined today by folks in that sector so that they can share their views. And we see that climate risk disclosure is already happening through private markets, and that businesses are already being hurt, for example, by the flash flooding that caused extreme damage throughout New Jersey in 2021, and even parts of the state in 2022, despite the fact that we've had a relatively dry year thus far. And we know that without adaptation, property values will be harmed, right? So what is this economic imperative that we share? How can we move forward down this road together and build that state of resilience? That's what we want to talk about today. And we're really, really pleased to have such great contributors. Associate Commissioner Angarone is going to introduce them. So look forward to the discussion, and thank you for joining us.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner. Good afternoon, and again, thank you for joining us. I am Katie Angarone, the Associate Commissioner for Science and Policy at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, and I'm honored to introduce our esteemed panel of experts. Our panelists have very impressive bios, and we invite you to read about them in more detail in the event booklet, which will be posted in the chat. We're so very thankful they've taken the time today to sit with us and talk about this important topic. I do want to add that this panel is being recorded and will go up on the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection Climate Change website following the panel. Our panel for today consists of representatives from the government, energy sector, the consulting industry, and the environmental justice community. They'll provide us with a diverse and unique perspective on the costs of climate change, and it will be our conversation will be moderated by the Department of Environmental Protection Commissioner Sean LaTourette, whom you've already met. Commissioner LaTourette is responsible for formulating statewide environmental policy while directing programs that protect public health and ensure the quality of New Jersey's air, land, water, and natural and historic resources. A lawyer and policymaker with more than 20 years of experience in environmental protection, the commissioner began his career defending victims of toxic exposure, including organizing and advocating for the needs of vulnerable New Jersey communities. And the commissioner will engage our panelists in a discussion with questions about the impacts to various sectors, as he said. So I'm delighted to welcome the following experts. Jane Cohen, Executive Director for the New Jersey Governor's Office of Climate Action and the Green Economy. Jane is a senior advisor to New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy, and she handles the environment and energy portfolio, leading work on the governor's clean energy agenda, environmental justice, and climate resilience work, among other key initiatives. I'd also like to thank New Jersey State Treasurer Elizabeth Mayer Moyle for joining us today. She's been serving as a cabinet member in the Murphy administration since early 2018, when she became only the second woman in New Jersey history to be confirmed to the post of state treasurer. Under her leadership, the state of New Jersey has received 3 credit rating upgrades, amassed a record surplus, made 2 consecutive full payments into New Jersey's pension system, which is a goal that has eluded administrations for decades. The treasurer has built a career in public service over the last 25 years that is defined by her advocacy for social justice, gender equity, and protecting the environment, including her time representing the 15th Legislative District as a member of the New Jersey General Assembly, while also serving as the director of the Mercer County Office of Economic Development and Sustainability. We also welcome Tamara Lind, Executive Vice President and General Counsel at Public Service Electric and Gas. As PSE&G's Chief Legal Officer, she oversees all legal matters and has responsibility for overall legal and regulatory strategy, and also oversees the company's Office of Corporate Secretary, Compliance and Claims, in addition to several other corporate functions. And we want to welcome also Marcus Sibley, who is an environmental and social justice activist, speaker, and poet with a deep and profound commitment to justice and progress. He serves as the chairman of the New Jersey Progressive Equitable Energy Coalition, the president of the Southern Burlington County NAACP branch, and the NAACP New Jersey Environment and Climate Justice chairman. We'll also hear from Lori Schumann, Director of Climate and Sustainability for Enterprise Community Partners Capital Division. In the Office of the President, Lori directs the efforts in the Capital Division for environmental, social, and governance strategy, development, finance, development, and management of climate risks for affordable housing across the nation. That brings us to Joel Sunken, who is a climate change specialist leader at Deloitte. Joel has 15 plus years of experience leading sustainability and climate change strategy and implementation programs and initiatives in both the public and private sector. As a climate change specialist leader, he advises federal and state and commercial clients on climate risk identification, quantification, and prioritization, as well as resilience and energy transition roadmaps and portfolio optimization. And last but certainly not least, Robert Azrin, Senior Research Analyst at Breckenridge Capital Advisors. Breckenridge is a Boston-based fixed income investment firm with over $40 billion of assets under management. In his role, Robert performs municipal bond credit analysis. Robert has been with the firm since 2017, and prior to Breckenridge, he was a credit analyst with U.S. Public Finance Group at Moody's Investors Service, covering local governments. Talk about a powerhouse of a panel. We're so delighted to have them here today. Once the panel concludes, we'll go over some Q&A housekeeping matters, and then we'll open up the floor to questions from attendees. And so as to not disturb the panel discussion until that time, the attendees' videos and sound will be off, and the chat function will be turned on after the panel discussion. So at this time, I'm going to hand it back to Commissioner LaTourette.
Well, thank you, Katie. And again, thank you to all of the panelists for making time to join us in this discussion today. So the first thing that I wanted us to talk a bit about is the work that we've been doing here in New Jersey to summarize the potential financial impacts of climate change for our residents, for our businesses, for the municipalities that we work with across the state. And so I wanted to ask Treasurer Moyo in the first instance, in your opinion, Treasurer, what are some of the areas of concern with respect to the impacts of climate change from a financial perspective for New Jersey, for states in the Northeast?
Well, thank you, Commissioner, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this great discussion. I'm really looking forward to it. As everybody on this panel knows, our location on the Eastern Seaboard exposes us to a variety of climate risks, including the severe storms and hurricanes and rising sea levels in coastal areas. And events like Ida that you mentioned, Sandy, and countless other storms in between really pose a significant threat to our infrastructure and may require us to construct additional infrastructure, as we're seeing right now with the forward-thinking rebuild by design projects along the Hudson River and in the Meadowlands. And while we can't predict the impact these climate events may have on the state's financial condition, we do know that any threat to human life or property poses a threat to our statewide economy. And under this administration, under the leadership of Governor Murphy and Commissioner LaTourette, we've been committed to ensuring that New Jersey remains leader in combating climate change, preparing for its impact, and also mitigating environmental harms. So over the past 5 years, our state budgets have allocated significant resources to react to climate events and prepare for future events that we see as threats and to hopefully mitigate potential damages. So while I can't speak for other Northeastern states, I can touch a bit on a few of the areas of climate-related investment in New Jersey and in our budgets. And they're in several tranches, as this group will understand. The first being workforce support and education, because it's crucial that we have ready and able workforce to tackle these challenges, these new challenges. And so our budgets have included millions of dollars in funding for programs like the Council on Green Jobs, which identifies workforce development programs, practices that support a more diverse workforce for our growing green economy, help workers who are going to be transitioning from impacted industries, set up pilot programs targeting green job placement services, on-the-job training programs, and the like. Also, investments in our New Jersey Wind Institute for Innovation and Training, which supports offshore wind workforce, and funding for support for the first in the nation climate change education standards, which our Department of Education implements along with support from Sean and his team at DEP. In terms of infrastructure support mitigation efforts, a major funding initiative under this governor has been green energy initiatives and the development of the first purpose-built wind port in the country. The administration in FY22 spent nearly $500 million to support that initiative, and it's expected to generate billions in economic benefits and power over 1.15 million homes with clean energy. And this year we expect to support the project with an additional $200 million. We've also invested tens of millions into our electric vehicle infrastructure. The governor's goal is to have a electric vehicle mandate of 100% electric state fleet by 2025. So this year's budget invests another $25 million to ensure that we have the charging infrastructure in place so that we can support the greening of that fleet. We're also doing shore protection and flood control, $61.5 million to protect public and private property and infrastructure from coastal storm damage, erosion, and shoreline migration. Sea level rise through projects like beach replenishment, construction, bulkheads, jetties, seawalls. We've also been utilizing our federal funds, as the commissioner knows, our state fiscal recovery funds for BPU's Small Business Energy Efficiency Stimulus Program, Water Infrastructure Program, $300 million for DEP's Water Infrastructure Program, $20 million for DEP's Greenway planning and development and remediation. And we're utilizing information funds from the Federal Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act for investments in our Department of Transportation's National Electric Vehicle Formula Program, money for the BPU's State Energy Program supporting activities to reduce carbon emissions, DEP's two-year pollution prevention grant program, and other programs. And then I just want to touch briefly on RGGI. To date, the state has dedicated 75% of our regional greenhouse gas initiative auction proceeds to clean and equitable transportation, 10% for blue carbon and forestry projects, and 10% for green bank development. And since Governor Murphy rejoined RGGI in 2018, our New Jersey's RGGI proceeds total almost $300 million. So for us in the Northeast and all states, we know this is a work in progress and we're learning more every day. But as I mentioned earlier, the Murphy administration is committed to making sure we dedicate the resources needed to be a leader in combating climate change and preparing for its impact. And we're going to continue to dedicate those resources. And so we're proud of the work that we've done, but we know there's a lot more ahead. So
thank you, Treasurer. I appreciate the remarks and your money. So please do keep it coming. And I think what the Treasurer hits upon is really important here, right? I think you can hear in the details of the budget the interrelationship between the reduction in greenhouse gases and the resilience building, right? When we talk about the build out of the first purpose-built wind port, right? We're doing that in a resilient manner at a future flood elevation that we know will protect this investment long-term for the benefit of the people of New Jersey, the companies that so much want to locate in our state because of our approach to capturing the supply chain, and at the same time that we're pursuing all of these deep investments in electrification, we're also looking at how we protect those investments as a matter of policy and investment strategy. So the fabric of those two ends of the climate policy spectrum are really weaved together in the approach, which I so very much appreciate. And what I wanted to ask a few of our panelists about, if you were you're listening to the Treasurer here on this statewide approach to these types of investments, if you were advising municipalities on preventative measures to advance resilience, to reduce climate risk, what might you recommend? Why don't we go to Joel in the first instance?
Excellent. Yeah, thank you, Commissioner, and appreciate getting to participate in this panel. So I think to me the first thing that I would really want to look at if I was a municipality was, to the greatest extent possible, having kind of a clear and shared understanding of risk. I know a lot of kind of, municipalities or departments within municipalities have a lot of difficulty in terms of understanding, kind of like the breadth of climate risk. So obviously there's a lot of different hazards that can be considered, and there's a number of different possible climate scenarios and climate projections that really impact that. And I think it becomes really difficult to make any sort of real apples to apples comparisons if people are all kind of speaking slightly different languages. And I should say, I think the DEP has done a pretty admirable job in creating some of those resources that can be relied upon. I know the GIS kind of mapping database feels like an excellent place to start. And then I think that there needs to be a lot of attention in terms of how you prioritize your risk exposure. Obviously not all assets are created equal, and every municipality is going to have a finite amount of resources to address it. So I think, really it's important to do a combination of evaluate the likelihood of an event occurring and the impact of that event occurring, and really defining collectively what are what are the critical assets that you really can't afford to lose for any reasonable amount of time? And so I think looking at things like the dependency or interdependency of these assets, the vulnerability of the populations that are relying upon those assets, the potential impact to say like health, being primary above an economic impact, that type of thing. And then I think, so obviously there's some assets that would require immediate action, but I think another important aspect is really looking at opportunities to institutionalize risk management into the policies and the regulations of that particular municipality. So I think looking at things like land use and building codes and emergency response plans to make sure that essentially every project to the greatest extent possible becomes a climate mitigation project as opposed to identifying these standalone efforts. And then I also think, exploring public-private partnerships makes a lot of sense. I mean, I can say I did a lot of work out of Sandy in Lower Manhattan, and you looked and saw a lot of the individual kind of private sector entities spent a considerable amount of money managing their risk. And I think if they had been a little bit more thoughtful about how to pool those resources, and kind of protect a whole district as opposed to just worrying about their buildings, you could get a lot more broad community benefits. And then the last thing, and I realize I've been talking for a while, is really to try to prepare for and anticipate federal grants. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of opportunity to do some meaningful work if you receive those types of grants, like the Rebuild by Design being a key advantage, and anticipating that and kind of doing the needs assessment in advance, I think goes a long way.
Really, really incredible points. What the through line, Joel, that we often will talk about among the environmental infrastructure administrators, I guess I would call us, the group of environmental secretaries across the country that are looking at how to best support municipalities in these endeavors. Recently, we were talking about with FEMA and with federal DOT, with folks in academia, about how the lens through which we should look at the IIJA, right? And one of the reflections that came out of this conversation cross states, cross the federal family of agencies, was that we shouldn't look at just one piece of this legislation, whether it's the IRA, whether it's the bipartisan infrastructure law, as having climate resilient components. We should look at the entire effort as a climate resilient effort, right? Because if we're stewarding billions of dollars in transportation investment, we should do that through a resilience lens. Same thing in water infrastructure. But it all depends on one critical thing, that you've done the thoughtful planning in advance at all, right? And a lot of our communities are really grappling with this for the first time and need that kind of planning assistance. Rob, I'm wondering if you have any reflections on the type of advice that local governments might benefit from.
Absolutely. Just as my role, a municipal bond investor, we're trying to kind of gauge whether the tax base and the economy will remain healthy in the face of climate change, and that the local governments continue to repay their obligations. We do want to see cities and towns start planning and moving forward on their plans. I've spoken to numerous local governments across the country, including in some of the most impacted areas of Florida, and read through a lot of climate action plans, and just have 3 or 4, observations, actions that I think municipalities can take that I think will, improve their odds of success. Joel kind of touched on this. Definitely the vulnerability assessment is key. It should be pretty comprehensive, not just your own critical infrastructure, but really the real estate, the tax base that's, funding the operations of the municipality, what the impact could be from a public health standpoint. So a thoughtful vulnerability assessment is really useful. And then on the mitigation side, a community-wide greenhouse gas emission emissions inventory. A lot of times what I see is just, it's the municipality just doing their own municipal operations, but it really should be a more holistic view. And, putting these dollars and cents on these risks, I think really helps the planning. It helps us as investors. And then just, for the planning itself, there's a lot of plans to do more planning out there. These plans really should have a list of actionable, realistic goals. There should be timelines. There should be, potential funding sources. And, there needs to be a structure of accountability in place. So often I see plans, it's put out in 2017 and then there's nothing, past that. So you really, like we like to see those periodic updates and progress reports. And then just, I think what can help that is just embedding and infusing resiliency kind of throughout the municipality. I would also say just the partnerships that Joel mentioned, but also just, I think this especially benefits smaller local governments. There's a lot of collective knowledge out there. Also, any regional planning that can be done, I think is useful. I see this in Florida with the Southeast Regional Climate Change Compact that's been fairly successful. And the other thing I think needs to be reiterated is that engagement's important. It really should be with all stakeholders in the community, including marginalized populations, as well as with business and nonprofits. This kind of comprehensive approach really can lead to greater, I've noticed, buy-in of projects, better solutions, and just increase the odds that the plans will actually be executed on. And fourth, and this is the last point, and maybe the most important, municipalities should really look into adopting a climate smart approach to capital planning that systematically factors in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and increasing resilience to climate risks. I think Joel mentioned that as well. A lot of good work being done in this space. We've had discussions with Professor Jan Whittington at the University of Washington. She has a great capital planning model that factors in adaptation and mitigation goals under various scenarios. And I think this really represents the next generation of municipal capital and infrastructure planning.
Really appreciate those points, Rob. One of the things that I will often say to the chagrin of the planners at DP, that so much of this starts with the unsexy work of planning, right? Mm-hmm. But not planning in the sense that we're going to come up with a report and feel real proud of ourselves, put it on a shelf, and now we did the thing. But actually, it needs to result in these specific deliverables that move the plan forward to make it actually meaningful. You hit on the point of engagement, and we're talking about local planning, and we're talking about local government. And when we talk, when we in state government are often thinking, when we're thinking about community impact, we often begin our thinking from the perspective of our engagement with local elected officials, from the perspective of engaging with the governance structures that exist. But we make the mistake of sometimes confusing that for engagement with the community. And so, Marcus, I thought you might have a perspective on that, on the advice for building local resilience.
Thank you so much, Commissioner, and I apologize for the background noise. I'm in New York Penn Station. I'm a panelist at the Nest Summit in about an hour, so apologies for that. Can you hear me? Can you hear me well? Okay. So the first thing I want to say is, one, it's an honor to be on this panel and to have this conversation about the economics, because we can't speak about the climate unless we bring in the economic piece, because economics has been what has run our country. You can't leave out what's run your country when you speak about anything. The next thing I want to speak about the communication piece that Joel touched on. Communication is essential. Municipalities need to communicate with their state and federal government, because, as you said, when that funding comes down, we have to understand that even though something may not be a problem today, there's sustainability work that has to be done today for the things that's coming tomorrow. A lot of times we like to focus in on environmental justice communities about how the climate crisis is impacting those neighborhoods, but many states have old pipes. Many states haven't done well with mitigation. So, and many towns. So their time is coming, and their time is coming if they don't start being proactive with getting a plan together, as Robert just mentioned. The second piece of the communication is, as you were alluding to, Commissioner, communication with the stakeholders. We often forget that the communities know what's great for the community. That's what's good, what's great, because they've lived in these environments their entire lives. They know what works. And unfortunately, far too often we have people in short-term positions doing the long-term planning. Think about that. So if you're in a short-time position and you're doing long-term planning, if you're not putting a long-term plan in place, only thing you're doing is you're creating something that has to be recreated every time there's a new cycle, every time there's new representatives in that place. And where does that leave the community? That leaves the community starting from scratch every 2 to 4 years, every 6 years. That's a terrible model. So what we need to do, and what our municipalities need to do, we need to make long-term plans, and there needs to be commitments from our elected officials and our governing bodies and within our municipalities saying, I'm committed to changing the climate. I'm not committed to getting reelected. Those are two different things. Because when people are working toward reelection, they're not thinking long-term. They're thinking, what can I get through? What do I need to say today? What is the tenor of our environment today? What do people want to hear today? And as you just said, Commissioner, it's not always sexy. Some things aren't sexy when it comes to sustainability. So people have to be understanding that some of these things take time. Some of the plans that we're working on in 2022 won't come to fruition until 2027. But that's the work, and we have to be committed to that work. And the other point I just wanted to bring in really, really quickly, we're speaking about connecting with the community. We have to understand we have to revisit our models of connecting with the community. A lot of the models we've been using for a long time haven't been beneficial, and the community has spoken up about that. And toward that end, the coalition that I chair, the New Jersey Progressive Equitable Energy Coalition, or NJPEAC, we're currently working on a pamphlet that will be a free download from our website. We're working with our attorneys, the Eastern Environmental Law Center, and the pamphlet is called A Guide to Equitable Access for Environmental Justice Communities. This is something we want people to look at and realize there are better ways to contact the people, because if you don't have the feedback or the buy-in of the people, you will never get the trust of the people. And that's a big problem. And that's not just for environmental justice communities. That's for all communities. People want to know that they have a stake in what's happening where they live, where they pay taxes, where they go to work, where they drive around, where they raise their children, where they see their nieces and nephews. They need to feel like they're a part of that process. So there are things that we need to do to work harder to get that information from those communities that we're talking about. And again, please understand my point. When I'm speaking about this engagement, I mean all communities. Yes, I'm an environmental justice activist. I fight for the overly exploited, the underrepresented people who have the least voices. I fight for them. But when I'm speaking about engagement, everyone USA wants to be a part of a process. So we need to engage all communities when it comes to planning. And the last piece is, as we're talking about risk, what risk are we talking about? Are we talking about financial risk? Are we talking about health risks? Those are two different things. Those are things we have to be honest about. If we're speaking about financial risk will always trump health factors. It has always been the case. It will always be the case. That's why it's important for us to show that sustainability can also be economically viable. That's the job we have to work on. And we have to show.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah,
exactly.
Couldn't agree more.
Right.
We have a penchant in our state, in this country for looking at these two things as diametrically opposed, right? And Governor Murphy said this yesterday at the Climate Week event, and where we're redoubling our commitments not just to offshore wind but to environmental justice, because you see so clearly that sound environmental policy that uplifts environmental and public health supports and promotes economic health, right? You can't actually have one without the other. It's not this decision that we've somehow been told over the years that's this binary false choice. I saw a hand from Joel, but first wanted to go to Lori, because we're talking about two things here that are very much your wheelhouse. And I think Marcus was singing your song a little bit there, because not just on the capital side, what kind of capital do we need to invest in, but in particular in communities like many throughout New Jersey that are struggling with a lack of affordable housing. How do you make these capital investments over time from the perspective of institutional investors in the housing market, while also trying to make sure that we're reaching our affordability goals, increasing housing supply in a way that isn't leaving already vulnerable people vulnerable or making them more vulnerable?
Thank you so much, Commissioner. It is a pleasure to be here on the panel today. I am a native New Jerseyan, grew up in Scotch Plains, really proud of my state for stepping forward with the kind of leadership that we're seeing from you, Commissioner, and certainly Governor Murphy, and everyone on this call for stepping forward today to spend time with us to discuss this. So New Jersey is, one of the things I will start by saying is climate change is not the problem. We are. The way that we're going to approach climate change and climate risks to our communities across the state will be to change the way that we are conceiving of designing, operating, and financing our community infrastructure and our housing. And we have an opportunity, which I'll just touch on, with new federal funding coming in to support this, but the leadership has to start today, and it has to start at the state level. And I want to plus up what Marcus just said about needing good leadership and good staffing that is on board for the long term, because this is going to be a long game that we're playing here. We're not in this to just create a Band-Aid to solve this situation. It's not going away. It's going to get worse. We're going to get more floods, more hurricanes, more heat events, etc. And at the same time, while the climate risk is severely impacting our communities, we're also dealing with the twin crisis of a lack of affordable housing. There are not enough affordable housing units in the state of New Jersey to ensure that families that are workforce, special needs, low income have a place to call home. So there's been a lot of debate about what happens when communities have to retreat from the coastline. I would offer that there is no such thing as retreat for a low-income family that cannot find a house to live in. Folks are going to stay in place until there's no more time left. And what that's going to lead to is an unmanaged retreat. So with more than 210,000 units needed to supply affordable housing across the state of New Jersey, we've got to get busy to start to create opportunities and affordable housing in safer areas. We've got to fortify our existing housing stock, even in the floodplain, right? So there's going to be issues and impacts to housing that exists in the floodplain today across New Jersey. And there's close to 2,000 units of affordable housing in the floodplain in New Jersey. The floodplain in New Jersey is big. And a lot of these housing units need to be preserved so that communities can be stabilized. So my offer is not only do we think about fortification of this housing in the floodplain and investment in this housing, but also thinking about where can we design and build more affordable housing on the upland areas. This is going to be a reversal, and many would have to ask, what are we doing about Mount Laurel? And how do we ensure that Mount Laurel, and the spirit of Mount Laurel, which is to distribute affordable housing across the state, is actually going to be advanced, right? So that's going to be an issue that we need to think about. I wanted to remark that investment needs to be placed in these communities. Material investment. Yes, we need to plan, but we need to execute. We need to act. And this is going to require intensive and deep investment, not only in the financial deals that need to take place to build this housing, but investment in communities to ensure that communities are not going to argue against affordable housing, that we're going to have the buy-in from all communities, and that it becomes a regulatory compliance. So 2 points I'd like to make, Commissioner. In addition to this, it's really important that the state takes lead here, because a lot of the funding resources, IRA, EJA, BRIC, other funding streams, come through the state. So the state needs to get organized and make sure that there is correspondence with the folks in DC that are going to be leading this effort, John Podesta or Mitch Landrieu. We also need to make sure that private sector is involved and engaged on this effort to make sure that there's enough capital brought in from the private sector to bridge and close the gap for the funding needs at present, because a lot of the funding required for affordable housing, for example, through the low-income housing tax credit program, which Enterprise is one of the nation's leading syndicators on, that requires investment from private sector. So that needs to be in place. And the third point I'd like to make is we also know that what's happening right now is not only are affordable housing units at risk and housing is at risk in general from climate change, but one of the material impacts of climate change is rising costs of insurance. So it's really critical that we get the state insurance commissioner to be part of this discussion to make sure that we can understand how to ensure that the insurance industry that's regulated by the insurance commissioner is able to play a part in not only financing insurance risk reduction, but offering incentives through their insurance products to encourage more investment in risk reduction and adaptation. Because at the end of the day, and I speak as a real estate industry finance professional, insurance moves the needle. And what we're going to be seeing, and I'll close here, is insurance industry volatility is going to lead to a lot of stranding of assets across the state of New Jersey because of climate risk, because of the volatility. So we need to get ahead of this. And so those are some ways we can deal with affordable housing, Commissioner. And thank you for the question.
So much there. Thank you, Lori. I do have a question I want to come around to on SEC issues, Liz, but I just want to keep going on this thread for a second because I think there's a lot of interrelationships between our panelists here. Because what you're explaining, Lori, is not lost on environmental regulators, right? We know that there is an overdevelopment within floodplains. We recognize we're the problem type perspective. On the flip side of that, we are also the solution. And I think you were getting at that a bit because you were talking about state leadership and you were, before you made your point about the insurance, which I think we should come back to, you were talking about the power of state government, whether it's through a better execution of Mount Laurel or some combination of state regulatory authority. It seemed like you were hinting at there needs to be a regulatory compliance obligation that moves the needle, which I think you would see a lot of. Great, I see Marcus's head nodding as well, because as much as we can plan, right, as much as we can incent, and we've done a lot of that in New Jersey, the private market alone isn't always enough, and the way that we pull and lead each other sometimes is through the wise constraints that make us free. And so what I offer that as a segue to this question, which is that we often hear that the price of adaptation is greater than the reward. And it seemed to me, Laura, you were picking at that. So I wanted to get your take and then a take from everyone around the board. So I'd like to start with you, Lori, and then go over to Tammy, because I know PS is really invested in that imperative.
It's interesting you said that statement, Commissioner, that the price of adaptation is greater than the reward. I think, and I want to get back to something Marcus said, when we think about the benefits and the multiple benefits of adapting to changing climate risk, and this is about our future, this is about adapting to not only the conditions of today, but what we're going to be seeing 5, 10, 30 years from now, which is, by the way, the lifetime of a mortgage, right? So when we are investing in deals, we're thinking now, and we must think not only about what the flood maps tell us today, as well as what they're going to tell us in 30 years, because we're still on the hook for those assets. Infrastructure, municipalities are still on the hook for the assets 100 years from now. That's not going anywhere. So the cost of adaptation and the yield from adaptation, I would offer, is materially significant. When we look at, and this needs to be considered, and this is not something that we've studied in depth yet, but we need to. And so this is a call to action for anyone on the call that has research capabilities. What are the projected rises and volatility and models around insurance rate rising with the rising costs of risk? And what can we do to adapt our physical infrastructure and physical assets, including our environmental assets, to these conditions so that we can ensure that we can meet the moment where it needs to be met? And so there is a strong financial consideration here. If we continue doing business as usual and just continue to invest in the infrastructure standards for today and not think about 5-10 years from now, what we will find is a denigration of our physical assets, an increase in insurance, and a gap that we will not be able to fill.
This is the critical point for us in organizing this panel to begin with. And I could not, I'm glad we're transcribing this because I could not have posed that question any better, Lori. So I'm gonna go back, I'm gonna write it down, and I'm gonna steal it and repeat it ad infinitum. I think it raises a question, Rob, for you on how that interplays into the bond considerations, and Joel and Liz for you. But first, Tammy, we're talking about infrastructure, the resilience of that infrastructure, and we as state government, we don't do that alone. I mean, none of us does anything alone. Our partners in the utility sector are crucial in building that resilience. How do you view this question, that cost of adaptation and that return on investment? Are we throwing money away by investing in that resilience today?
Thank you. And can you hear me okay? This is Mike. And I'm so honored to be here. I've just so much enjoyed listening to all the other panelists so far. And it's a simple question, because the answer is we absolutely need to invest. We need to plan, we need to invest, we need to collaborate with all of the various stakeholders if we are going to be prepared for the future. And as PSEG's oldest and largest utility serving millions of customers in the state, that's not something you wait to do when there's a next storm. We've been working on this, and we are continuing to work on it ever since Superstorm Sandy, which was a major kind of just transformational point for, I think, many of us. We were always focused on investing in our infrastructure for the future. We've been in New Jersey for more than 100 years. We plan to be here for the next 100 and more. But Superstorm Sandy was a turning point, and we started to work with the state and our many stakeholders, the municipalities, our customers, the many groups that have ideas and views. And we had a large program that we worked with the state on to raise many of our substations that were flooded and damaged during Superstorm Sandy. And we now have seen that those stations that were raised when the other storms came since Superstorm Sandy, and there have been many significant storms that have occurred and that most likely will occur in the future, the outages for our customers were dramatically reduced. Just to give you some facts and figures, in Superstorm Sandy, we had more than 2 million customers. And I know many of you, including myself, were out of power for a long time. Those were businesses, people who didn't have other options to have a generator in their backyard, or hospitals that were suffering. And then the most recent storm that had a big impact on our service territory, which was Hurricane Ida in 2021, had major damage to the state, but we only lost power to about 215,000 customers compared to that 2 million. And we saw the outage times reduced dramatically. So our Energy Strong program was a great example of where planning and investing and doing it in the right way, making sure you're choosing the right investments, right, to get ready for the future. You can't just throw money at things. You have to make sure that you understand, as was talked about by many other panelists, you need to understand the potential vulnerabilities. You need to plan, you need to communicate, and then you need to invest. And we're continuing to do that. We just received approval in New Jersey for something called the Infrastructure Advancement Program. Was just approved this year. And over the next 5 years, we'll be doing grid modernization under that program to get ready for the future challenges. So it's a long process. You don't do it just when there's a problem. You have to plan for it. You have to invest in the infrastructure, whether it's the port, the wind port that was referenced before, which we're proud to have been a part of and continuing to be part of that development of that important wind port, or whether it's maintaining carbon-free generation and making sure it's there for the future, nuclear power that is important to New Jersey, or investing in offshore wind, or the transmission to deliver that offshore wind. All of those things take a lot of time, a lot of engagement with communities and stakeholders, but they absolutely are the right thing to do for the future.
Really, really appreciate those remarks, Tammy, and more importantly, the work that PS has continued to invest in to secure that future. I may have this fact wrong, so correct me. But the outages during Sandy, as PS was working on restoring that power, the majority of the outages, if I'm recalling this correctly, were a function of 4 or 5 substations that were built at the time of Thomas and Alva Edison, right? A function of our aging infrastructure in the state of New Jersey, and that we're not as ready as we could be. Is that ringing true for you?
I don't know whether it was 4 or 5, but I do know that it was certainly aging infrastructure, and I can follow up on whether it was 4 or 5, but certainly aging infrastructure was a problem, and it continues to be a challenge. And of course, every time you invest, that infrastructure will eventually age, right? So you have to constantly be looking for that replenishment in the right way and in the right location. So you're right. That aging infrastructure is a key challenge that we take very seriously, and the other utilities do as well.
Sure. Thank you. Jane, Cohen, do you have a view across the field of agencies and state government in the work on climate action and the green economy? How do you respond to the notion, the value proposition of resilience?
Well, good morning, good afternoon, Commissioner, and good afternoon, everyone. I have to say it is, in a way, unusual to be on a panel where you're actively taking notes as your other panelists are speaking. And I'm really thrilled to be on a panel where I think everybody is acknowledging that actionable approaches are really important and that we really put a priority on thinking about what actions we can take now. And Commissioner, I think this really goes to your question about the value of resilience. People really like to ask that question, what is sort of the price of inaction versus the cost of action? And I think that's just a problematic statement or question kind of from the get-go. Inaction makes you think of status quo. And we are not in a static situation. And I think that's just really important to acknowledge. We talk high level, frequently about the kind of increasing impacts of climate change. But when you really drill down into the everyday impacts in a state like New Jersey, you realize just how quickly things are changing. And it's easy to say, these are incremental changes because over sort of the long term they may be, but in the way that they are impacting and that they are sort of gathering steam is, very much a lived experience of people now. And so I think it's just important that when we think about, not taking action, that really is not what we're doing when we think about just how quickly things are changing and how it really is an imperative that we kind of change our approach in order to match that reality. I think when you think about just all of the ways that, and I think everybody on this on this panel today has really kind of outlined them, all of the ways that our state, our communities are impacted by climate change. And obviously, Marcus is talking about it, both from the community perspective, but also really looking at sort of municipality level, and, Lori talking about affordable housing. I mean, we see just that it really is not sort of an isolated impact, that the impacts are across our economy. And so if we flip sort of the question around and we ask, how can our investments today strengthen our economy and strengthen our communities, not just for, the kind of scientific climate impacts that we talk about, sea level rise, flooding, et cetera, but the kind of all of society impacts that we feel. And I really am a true believer that we have a moment right now with the federal funding coming in, with a government here in New Jersey that really cares about this, to build programs from the ground up that allow us to prioritize our communities and allow us to prioritize workforce and economic development in a sustainable way. And I hope, and this is what I do every day, and I know Commissioner and the Treasurer, that this is what we all work towards. But I really, really, my dream is that we meet this moment and that we show that at this kind of critical juncture, we are taking these investments and we are showing and we are building a more resilient and a more sustainable and a more just future for everyone.
Couldn't agree more. We have a moment. So appreciate your leadership through it. We're going to shift into Q&A. As we do that, Rob, the case for resilience as a municipal bond investor. Let us get your perspective on that.
Sure.
And folks, start submitting questions into the Q&A panel.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree with Tammy and Jane completely. Just when looking at the numbers, there's huge property value at risk, GDP at risk, public health at risk, and these greatly exceed any kind of reasonable costs of adaptation. I think there's been various studies. I think a FEMA study said $1 in resilient infrastructure spend yields $6 of benefits. And the other thing is, like, when doing these cost benefit analysis, if it's being done at all, it's not always clear all the analysis are taking into account the full range of benefits. Ideally, the analysis would factor not only the economic, but the social and ecological benefits as well. And there's often a lot of co-benefits, as I think another panelist mentioned as well, from doing these projects.
Appreciate that. Katie Angarone is going to moderate our Q&A. But Joel, you had a perspective to share on the question of cost and municipal advice. As Katie tees up our questions, I wanted to make sure we got to that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I do think, to kind of reiterate, the point that Rob made. I mean, there's a lot of studies that have kind of put to rest, I think, the idea that there's not an economic justification for it. And then I do think that, also to his point, that doing, more qualitative cost benefit is, I think, an essential component. Not only looking at kind of like the social equity piece and the ecological piece, but also some of the, the costs of time out of service. I think not having access to those particular assets can have much wider ranging economic consequences and longer lasting economic consequences than just the cost to repair or replace, which I think also just kind of speaks to the need to have better more kind of quantitative and objective data to help kind of guide a lot of this decision making, so you can really understand, where the trade-offs are. And, like I mentioned before, I don't think all risks are equal. And so I think, and I think that's true also from kind of a timing and sequencing standpoint, that there's some risks that you need to address now, there's some that you need to address at particular times in the future. And then I think there's also a lot of ways in which proactive planning really allows you to integrate it into your capital planning or your asset management, because the additive cost of making a building, say, more resilient is going to be considerably lower than having to retrofit that building after the fact. And I think that kind of knowledge makes a big difference.
No question. We still have a lot of work to do to convince folks that that's true, because the knee-jerk reaction is that it isn't true, and that the added cost of adaptation or the added cost of resilience will make the pursuit of a project impossible, right? That is sort of a first stumbling block that for some in the development sector we have to get past still. Katie, do you have a first question teed up for us?
Commissioner.
Marcus, yeah.
Can I have 20 seconds?
Oh, by all means, yes.
I just had to make this quick comment. I'm sorry, Katie, but the buzzword for the last 2 or 3 years has been environmental justice. Everyone has been saying it, but we always forget the communities that are most impacted are these environmental justice communities. So if we're speaking about the cost, if these people in these communities are getting burdened with asthma and cancer and all types of respiratory issues that's impacting their mobility, impacting their longevity, then the question has to really be looked at. Like, let us not continue to say environmental justice if we don't really want to do justice work. Justice work means let's start realizing that sometimes money is important, but people have been for centuries overburdened, exploited, disrespected. So I just always want to make sure we quantify and qualify that. Because it's
absolutely. The point, the finer point for us from a regulatory perspective, from an accountability perspective, is that when you don't integrate the cost of resilience, or you don't integrate the cost of pollution control into your project, it's not as though that cost doesn't exist. You're externalizing that cost. Someone else is paying it, right? There is a direct impact, and the first payor is the fence line community, and the next payor is all of us when we overtax our healthcare system. So I am with you, my friend. Katie, what's that first question?
All right, Commissioner, we're actually just going to talk real quickly about the sort of rules of the road. That was an amazing discussion. I think we could take an entire day on it. We have about 23 minutes or so left. And we are going to take questions. We've asked folks to raise their hand. And I will call upon you. We will activate your camera and your mic. I will go first to the raised hands, and then as we're able, we will take some questions in the chat. So we have Joseph Herbert. All right, Joseph, you can unmute yourself now. Thank you so much for joining us. All right, Joseph, your mic is live.
Okay, can you guys hear me now?
Yep, you're good. Okay.
The key thing we're forgetting here, sustainability is survivability. You know, there's none of us here on this panel that can tread water for a long period of time. And we're going to have that. We got another problem coming up too when you're talking about federal funding. We cannot depend on federal funding. It changes every 2 years. Okay. Now, so largely what has to happen within the state. Milankovic and Wegner and Gutenberg talked about this before the First World War. They told us, this panel, that global warming was coming. Okay. they guaranteed it in intents and purposes because Milankovitch's paperwork is recognized now by the UN. But the whole thing that we're looking at here is a planning situation. And we have to convince the counties and the municipalities to get involved with this planning. In Ocean County, we are standing in the possibility of losing probably 40% of our revenue producing effort. We're going to lose in excess of 35 to 40% of our affordable housing. Ocean County doesn't really have any non-affordable housing, and any what you call regular, what ordinary people would call regularly affordable housing. We have
thank you so much. I'm sorry to cut you off. We have so little time that I want to give our panelists some time to react to that. Lori, that sounds like that was up your alley, and then Tammy, you have your hand up as well. So if we could go in that order, that would be great.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that comment. And it is about survivability, and it is my core belief, and the belief that Enterprise has and has had for 40 years, is that affordable housing is a human right. It is also the building block for a community, for a region, for a state, and for a nation. The first thing that happens when there's a climate event, we can see what's going on in Puerto Rico right now, is housing goes down. Well, the first thing that happens is the electrical grid goes down. And then we start to see impacts to housing. And it's very, very critical that we understand how to deal with housing adaptation and resiliency, because when the housing goes down, that means constituents and taxpayers are homeless and displaced, and that cannot be, that's not a survivable reality for anyone, let alone elected officials and anyone who is playing a significant economic role in a community. I just want to add that Enterprise, we've developed a climate risk reduction platform for housing. So if anyone's interested in this, I'm happy to share this after the call. But the way we're approaching housing is to stabilize it, to build it to a better and more resilient standard, and to ensure that it's preserved and protected. And when we build anew, it should all be emblematic of all of the best practices that we know are at play today.
My turn of phrase for that, Lori, number one, thank you, is let's, for the love of God, for the love of each other, build things that stand the test of time in a changing climate. Tammy.
Yes, and thank you for your question. There was a lot packed in there, and I want to react to two things. First, you're absolutely right that we have to make sure that at the state and local level, we are focused on this issue. We cannot, and New Jersey has been great about this, we cannot just rely upon the federal government. We should keep pushing the federal government to do the right thing. And they have made some, positive steps, but we have to. And New Jersey has been wonderful. And we have been so proud of New Jersey and what they've done. And at the municipal level, I do want to remind all of the municipal folks on the phone that your local utility, for those of you who are in PSE&G's service territory, but I think all of the utilities would welcome the opportunity to help you understand what programs the utilities offer to partner with the local municipalities. For example, energy efficiency investments. PSE&G has these wonderful programs available to partner with municipalities as well as low-income families and a variety of other economic groups in the state and our service territory. And we help fund energy efficiency investments that can really help you deal with some of these issues going forward. So thank you.
All right, Treasurer.
Just really quick, I'm sorry, but I just wanted to connect what Marcus has been saying with what Mr. Herbert was saying. The resources are definitely limited. We all know, those of us in state government, local governments, nonprofits, how challenging it is with all the competing needs for limited resources. So part of the big challenge and why events like this are great is what Marcus keeps, trying to remind us. We've got to make sure that our communities understand how important it is to utilize some of these limited resources for this purpose, that it's helping those communities, it's helping our state and nation as a whole in our world, and that it's absolutely critical. Not sexy, like some people have said earlier in the call, and also it may seem like it's this future world thing, but half of the challenge is going to be making sure, because we hear it here in Treasury, there are so many worthwhile competing needs for limited resources, but this is so important, and we just need to make sure that message gets out there.
Jane, if you'll indulge me, I think I'm going to just let Diane Jansen in, and then hopefully we'll get to your point at that time. Diane, your mic is live. Diane, are you speaking? We can't hear you. All right. Actually, I do have a question from the chat, Jane, that I think would be perfect for you, from Patricia Marcita. Policy can drive investment. What policy measures, if any, are in place to promote the use of green technology in the specifications for port marine infrastructure? If none, what would it take to adopt such a policy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there's, just sort of in general, a lot of questions around, what a public-private partnership should look like in the resilience and in the mitigation space. And this is something we're very focused on here in New Jersey. And as Sean, I think, mentioned at the top of the call, yesterday we released our report from the New Jersey Council on the Green Economy that really lays out how the private sector can work together with government in order to see both the resilience and the mitigation measures that we want. And I think it's a couple things. First of all, it's really having a commitment from the private sector and an understanding that there's really a role to play for those folks. And I think, at a sort of high level, we're seeing a lot of major companies put their, net zero goals and their emission reduction targets. But as we've been talking about on this call, it's really much more than that. First of all, we want to make sure that those investments are real and that they are making measurable changes in the communities where these companies actually are and operate. And then that it's not just around kind of emissions reductions or renewable energy technology, but how are, again, these companies kind of leveraging this opportunity to increase workforce opportunities, to bring new people into the workforce, to make sure that in the communities where, either they're headquartered or more likely where some of their operations may be, that, they're contributing to the communities in a positive way. I think where government really plays a role in partnership is exactly to this question, which is sort of what are sort of the regulatory tools, the incentives that we have to, either work with companies to increase their R&D in certain areas, or to really work on some of those emissions reductions. And this is an area that we're putting a lot of focus on in New Jersey through our Economic Development Agency. We have a whole suite of tools that we're looking at to really increase both our R&D, our renewable technology, but also really to work on our emissions reductions. And we have a lot of examples of that. I don't want to take up too much time, but I think this is, in New Jersey, we're really leading in this space and we're very proud of it.
All right, thank you, Jane. We're going to unmute Scott Minich next. Scott, thanks for joining us. Please unmute yourself and introduce yourself.
Scott Minnick. I'm with Dewberry, and sorry, my dogs are barking behind me because my wife just got home. But working in the area of transportation resilience, and Sean, we've talked about this, I think almost a year ago about this. And in transportation and PSE&G and linear infrastructure, you impact and cross many communities. So from a resiliency standpoint, we're talking about funding available to communities and what communities should be looking at. My personal worry, this isn't professional, my personal worry is that environmental justice communities will get left out because we're leaving, community-based resilience up to them, where this whole aspect of climate change resiliency doesn't see municipal boundary lines. They don't see there's more watershed based. And really, New Jersey is going to be one of the largest, the highly impacted state in the country, and made of the most highly impacted places on the planet when it comes to climate change resiliency. So the question I guess I have is, what's being done on a state planning level, because we have so many coastal resources, water resources, some of the best, I believe in the world and obviously in the country. But how are we going to protect those communities, but also our resources throughout the state?
And I think your question is the question, Scott.
Yeah,
and I appreciate it, and I always appreciate our conversations on transportation resilience. And I think we're getting there. I think you'll see that as a function of new investments under IIJA. I know that Commissioner Scacchetti is deeply invested in ensuring that as we deploy transportation investments, that we are protecting people, that we are protecting property, because I know she holds that in her heart. But at the same time, the federal government at this moment in time, with the Biden administration's focus on environmental justice and civil rights, if we as state governments, I just got out of a conference on this very score, if we as state governments are not pursuing those investments through an environmental justice lens, there is civil rights liability for the state government that is receiving those federal funds. So we must, I see Marcus nodding his head because I know he and his colleagues has pushed hard for this position and it was successful. So we must pursue those investments in a manner that is going to protect our communities and include them on the front end, not on the back end as a check the box engagement measure.
All right, thank you. We are going to go next to Hannah Katz. We're going to unmute you, Hannah. There you go. Thank you.
Everyone, can you hear me?
If you could speak up a little louder, that would be great.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Much better. Thank you, Hannah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah Katz, and I'm an employee underneath the city of Jersey City, a wonderful city. But as you know, we experience a lot of the environmental and climate issues that we're talking about today, such as flood, disaster, environmental justice, chromium, and so on. So with the department I work in recently, we accomplished a wonderful environmental education campaign where we taught over 600 students in Jersey City about recycling, composting, and climate change. And something I've learned throughout my career, though I'm young, I've had quite a career with the state so far, and I've learned that there is still a gap in environmental education and knowledge throughout the state and in our country in general, with adults and with children. So something I've always felt was that resilience comes from a place of understanding and knowledge. And if we fully equip our residents and citizens with knowledge to understand the world around us, then we'll have more resilience as a nation. So my question to you all today is there any plan moving forward to improve or expand environmental education programs in our state? Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Commissioner, do you want to talk about education and outreach?
Well, I think the treasurer hit upon this in her opening remarks about investments in educating folks in her opening remarks. So maybe Liz, if you wanted to hit upon that, and I think Jane can also speak to it because it's a whole of government issue.
Well, I will totally defer to Jane on this because this is a Department of Education, Environment. Her office took a lead on this, and as I mentioned, first in the nation for K-12 education standards on climate. So I'll completely defer to Jane on this.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add to that and say, so this was an initiative of the First Lady, who has just a long career in climate, and this is a issue that's very dear to her heart. And so she really pushed forward and worked with DOE, our Department of Education, and our Department of Environmental Protection on these first in the nation climate education standards, which are now being rolled out across New Jersey. And this is, really to educate our students from K to 12 on all issues around, not just climate, but also sustainability, and really understanding, locally the impacts in New Jersey, and also critically, to a point that Marcus made and also the treasurer made, to our workforce. And so, as we move from, K to 5 to 8 to 12, having some of that education be not only about our own climate and climate change, but also really, what are employment opportunities around climate, around environment, around sustainability, so that we can ensure that our young people, really have the opportunity for good careers in the climate, environment, and sustainability space.
Thanks, Jane. Joel, I think earlier you had touched on the importance of engagement and outreach as well. I wonder if you could offer your perspective on the importance of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think both in the public and private sector, I think really having a good understanding of climate change, and I think having the right capabilities and capacities to enact a lot of the programs and kind of efforts that are going to be necessary is really important. And a kind of, I mean, I guess semi-related thing, and I think this speaks to what Marcus had brought up earlier. I mean, I've found, particularly working on resilience projects, that doing really active community engagement from the very, at the very beginning, from, to keep people kind of involved and not giving them the opportunity to comment, or not, keeping them apprised of what's happening, but giving them a real meaningful opportunity to have a say in kind of like how these significant pieces of infrastructure that are going to impact their communities, what is prioritized, what shape they take, that type of thing, both kind of creates a more dynamic, more equitable community. But I think from a practical standpoint, it also often kind of speeds the ability that we can move, because you engender a lot more kind of broad support.
Thank you so much.
Jane, can I just speak to that really quickly? I have a lot of experience with environmental education, and before I came to Enterprise, I built the state of California's first off-grid environmental education center in an environmental justice community, and we featured a variety of infrastructure solutions to deal with climate risks: off-grid solar, wastewater treatment, full living building, insulation. I mean, the list goes on, and we really tried to make sure that it was an environmental education center that had meaning and really demonstrated through practice the material issues that we need to understand to deal with climate risk. I would offer that we need to define and redefine what we mean by environmental education with respect to climate risk. We need to teach our kids and our students about the trades, about electricity, about distribution, about plumbing, about all of the core essential issues related to infrastructure and climate risk. It's no longer just about teaching about the beautiful and wonderment of our unbuilt environment. We've got to think about how to teach and train on the built environment. And we need to keep investing in our trade schools to make sure that this work is carried through to jobs and training of the workforce.
I could not agree more with that. Marcus.
Yeah, I just want to really quickly, Commissioner, just say, I'm also the director, National Wildlife Federation for New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. And I like to applaud NWF, and there's many other organizations that are heavily invested in climate education. Many of those representatives on this call, so I want to say hi to them. But the piece about education, I think we always forget, you can educate someone all day, But if they don't trust you, it's hard for them to make an investment in what you're trying to give them, even if it is helping them. And I think one of the big trust issues that communities have is when people are talking about the environment, we care about pollution because of the environment, but then they're quiet about all the other things that's happening in that environment. Like Laurie's speaking about the housing inequalities and the lack of jobs and the police brutality and all these other factors that impact their environment every day. I don't think people are going to really buy into climate change, climate education, until they see these same groups buying into what's happening to those communities.
So it's a really important point, Marcus, and I I connect that up often to the priority that Governor Murphy has put around community engagement, the work that we're doing with your help, and thank you, on engaging with our environmental justice communities as a routine matter, to sit down, to listen, to hold the hardship and the trauma that affects people. You go, you sit down, you listen, right? So that you can act. And it requires us to look differently at our approaches as government, as business, in terms of how we both pursue projects, how we build things, how we permit things, how we govern, right? Because what we have historically done is made decisions for people in their communities. And then as the decision was 95% baked, we've then presented it in a check the box public engagement, notice in a newspaper nobody ever reads type of process. And it's thoroughly unworkable and it leaves people out. And what we have to do is put our engagement up front always, and that we engage not for the sake of engagement, but we engage for the purpose of action. And by doing that, we can bring people along, but we've got to do it first, not when we need something. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and from Marcus and Joel and Rob and Jane and Lori and Tammy to Treasurer Moyo, thank you for everything you do. Katie and the DEP team who put this together, you are incredible. And to everybody that tuned in, thank you. Let Climate Week be every week, please. Because I think for our communities in New Jersey to meaningfully reduce and respond to climate change, we have to focus on the long-term growth and protection of our communities. And we have to commit ourselves, as you heard the panel talk about here today, to actions and investments that are going to take time to show their benefits, just like a warming planet has taken time to show us its fury. But we get there, right? We'll get there, but we have to acknowledge that it may not be possible, as this panel has talked about, to measure our success in the next budget or on the next ballot, right? We do this the way we only have ever done meaningful things, and that's together. So thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Again.
Thanks, everyone.